seeking an Australian case for tariff protection, the context, content and report of the 1929 Brigden Report. The subject of this talk is the attempt of several economists of the Brigden Report to make a rational case in favour of moderate protection. So the question which I'm addressing today is, well, what was this case and how good a case was it? My thesis is that the case is made up from quite standard materials. So it's not made up from something peculiar or odd or something non-standard. As to how good a case it was, well, I don't think it was a very good case, and yet they did raise issues which will always impede and vex any attempt to secure free trade. I'll first sort of give a little bit of the historical background to the report. I'll then run through the case, which is a simple piece of theory, and then I'll evaluate the case with a bit of help of the economic afterlife of the case. So, the context of the report was 1920s Australia. As Peter has already drawn to our attention, we had a growing tariff. I mean, his figures are more sophisticated, but you can see that that's a simple estimate of the average tariff rate. And just to bring out that, let's just look at the tariffs on a particular category, motive power machinery, percent. You can see that they're sort of starting off at 12.5%, a healthy 30%, 40%, by 60%, and by 1930, 70%. There seems to be just a very general direction in this rate of protection. Now, into this scene, they're into two more things. Firstly, a new discipline called economics, and a new creature called the economics expert. Before World War I, economics was essentially do-it-yourself. But in the 1920s, for the first time, there was on the public arena in Australia a tiny nucleus of the economics profession, which sort of presumed to be able to advise on economic issues with the authority of learning and science. The third element of the background was a different sort of Prime Minister, Stanley Melvin Bruce. I think it's true to say that he's the only Australian Prime Minister who has had a significant commercial career before becoming Prime Minister. In fact, he was in the import business, I believe. So that might have given him a slightly different outlook on this ever upward trend in the tariff rates. He was also, reflecting the spirit of the times, he aspired to apply scientific methods to achieve, the phraseology of the day, national efficiency. Okay, and there's a photograph of the Prime Minister, a politically incorrect photograph. I thought I'd choose of him lighting up with a digger there. And what he did in 1927 was to commission 5 economic experts, J.B. Brigden, D.B. Copeland, L.F. Gidland, E.C. Dyson and C.H. Wickens, to undertake a review of Australia's tariff. And the result was the Australian Tariff and Economic Inquiry, which is often known, rightly, essentially, as the Brigden Report. Now, the thesis of the Brigden Report was essentially twofold. In Australia's circumstances, a policy of tariff protection would reduce the income of the nation as a whole, but would increase the income of, well, perhaps the majority, very large, well, let's say a majority of its citizens. Now, you can see that there was something shocking in this suggestion. For it to come, not to come from just anybody, Freddie Egg, but to come from economists. Because the whole tendency of economic thought for well over, since the time of Adam Smith, was that the tariffs were harmful, not just to the sort of national income, but to the general interest. Any friend of humanity, of the public interest, could only be hostile to tariff protection. The whole tendency, since at least the time of Adam Smith, was that any beneficiary of a tariff could only be a minority. I think the tendency of thought was that only those factors, the owners of those factors which were immobile, which could not move between sectors, but which were happily situated in a protected sector, only the owners of those factors could benefit from protection. So we had a simple economy of producing wine and manufacturing clothes, The owners, those people who owned, say, land suitable for the production of wine grapes, okay, well, yes, they would benefit from the tariff. The price of wine would go up, and that would be good for them. But there would obviously be a very small group indeed. To put it in slightly more analytical terms, I think the whole tendency of the profession and of economic doctrine was that the only category of income that could benefit from a tariff were rents, rental income, okay, whether it's concrete in terms of land rent or more generally. And, well, rents couldn't be such a large category of national income. So here we have a quite sort of shocking suggestion. The case for the Brigden thesis is, well, I have to say it's not really very clearly in the Brigden Report. The Brigden Report was written by a committee. And within the committee there was a difference of opinion. Where D.B. Coleman was much more cautious about this protectionist thesis than say, Brigden and even in Gibbon was. You'll find, but nevertheless, it underlies the whole report, and it's the theoretical statement I suggest to you of the report is found in this paper there, the Australian tariff and the standard of living. And it's all quite clearly there. So let's go through what was the case for their two critical contentions. Well, these are the assumptions. We have two sectors, agriculture and manufacturing, very standard. Australia exports the agricultural good and imports manufactures and has no control over the terms of trade or the relative price of manufactures and agriculture. We have diminishing marginal productivity of labour in agriculture, that makes sense, but constant marginal productivity of labour in manufacturing, a classic assumption which we can talk about. Right, so let's put the model in a diagram. We can measure the total supply of the economy along here, and with some point along there sort of divides up the total labour supply between the amount of labour being in manufacturing, so we can measure manufacturing labour in that direction, and the amount of agricultural labour in that direction, we can measure in that direction. On the two axes, we can have the marginal value product of agricultural labour and manufacturing labour. And when we put in our earlier two assumptions, we get those two schedules, where this schedule refers to the constant marginal value product of manufacturing labour, well, this is the diminishing marginal value product of agricultural labour. And the equilibrium, as you can guess, is that allocation of labour between these two sectors such that the marginal value product in the two sectors are equal. Labour is paid, it's productivity, in value terms at the margin, so labour is going to move around, so it's just allocated itself nicely, so that its marginal value product is the same in the two sectors. So let's now see how a tariff is going to reduce national income, which I want to emphasise is something which the Brigden case allowed for, right? It didn't dispute this. A tariff will reduce national income. Well, what's going to be the impact of, say, putting a tariff on manufacturers? Well, of course, the price of manufacturers will go up. What else can it do? So up goes the price of manufacturers. Okay? And so the equilibrium will change. And of course the equilibrium, which is all perfectly standard, will involve a decrease in agricultural labour and consequent increase in manufacturing labour, which is measured by this distance, as labour reallocates itself away from agriculture towards manufacturing, where the marginal value productivity has been increased on account of this tariff raising the price of manufacturers. What's going to be the impact of that of agricultural output? Well, that's going to be the loss of agricultural output. Okay, people are producing less agriculture. Every man adds his marginal product, so we just add up the distance under that schedule. That's the loss of agricultural output. What about the increase, though, in manufacturing output? Well, we can do the same thing. We just look at that shift in employment and the area under the marginal product schedule, we add up. Notice that we're using the world prices, not home prices. Okay, and that's quite rational, of course. Right? I mean, just think of a farmer producing two goods, sort of exporting some to the market and importing others from the market. When we want to know how well off the farmer is, we look at the prices which the market gives the farmer, not the own prices which he might use on the farm. And so when we want to measure Australia's welfare, we look at the prices which the world gives and which the world pays. So we use world prices to evaluate the gain of manufacturing output. And we can see that there's a net loss of total output. That's all perfectly standard, okay? You can summon up the talismanic phrase, comparative advantage. That's what it is. It's absolutely standard analysis. But let's now look at the second thesis, that a tariff increases real wages. Presumably the majority of the citizens earn their incomes by real wages. Well, we know that the real wage in terms of manufacturers is simply the nominal wage, which I'm calling W, deflated by the price of manufacturers. But as I've already noted, the nominal wage is, of course, the productivity of labour at the margin in value terms. Or, in other words, the real wage is just the productivity of labour in terms of manufacturers. That's the real wage of manufacturers, just the productivity of labour in terms of manufacturers. But that thing on the right-hand side is a given by assumption. So the real wage in manufacturers is also a given and unchanged by the tariff, not reduced. All right, so much for manufacturers. But what about the real wage in terms of agriculture? Well, the real wage in terms of agriculture is a similar sort of thing. The wage divided by the price of agriculture, therefore the real wage is the marginal product of labour in agriculture, and the marginal product of labour in agriculture has increased. Of course it has. That's just going back to that diagram a little bit simplified. Of course, fewer people are working in agriculture. The marginal product of labour in agriculture has increased. And so we have our conclusion that the real wage in agricultural goods has increased. So the tariff leaves the wage in terms of manufacturers unchanged, but increases the real agricultural wage. Labour, one way or another, has to be better off. And if most people receive most of their income from labour, there you get the result. Now, let me now move to evaluation. Perhaps one of the first things we could think about, well, hang on, the whole case that somehow a tariff on manufacturers will raise the real wage, it does depend critically on the marginal productivity of labour being exogenous, somehow a given, not diminishing. Now, there are various ways of rationalising that, and I thought I would give one rationalisation which some colleagues of mine at the ANU suggested to me, but I might just skip over that. I might just instead, given that time seems to be a little bit costly, I might instead sort of segue, if I can use that term, without avoiding the question, but to move a little bit, without avoiding the question, take up a little bit of the aftermath of the whole report. The report was certainly not a shock heard around the world, but it did amount to the sound of a distant cannon, okay, in places around the world, in Harvard, in Oxford, in Cambridge, etc. It was heard, it was attended to, it did get noticed. So the most distinguished trade theorist of the day, Jacob Weiner, gave it a very cool and clinical and negative review. Some local economists found it very irritating indeed. So Shan deemed it to be just a plea for monopoly. Leslie Melville called it an ingenious fantasy that is not wholly fantastic. So there was this reaction, including a reaction by P.A. Samuelson. P.A. Samuelson, with his co-author Wolfgang Stolper, started thinking about this whole issue. Well, yes, tariffs will reduce national income, but what will it do to factor prices? And they started thinking in terms of a simple two-factor, two-good model. And they came to a very striking conclusion. In such a two-factor model, there will be always some factor whose share of costs in the production of the import good is greater than its share of costs in the production of the export good. There will always be some factor which is used, if you like, relatively intensively in the import competitive sector compared to the export sector. It'll account for a greater share of costs in the import sector than it will in the export sector. Okay? And their conclusion was, in the realm of that model, that a tariff will increase the income of that factor which is used relatively intensively in the import competing sector. that coheres completely with Brigden. Because, of course, labour accounts for 100% of the costs in the import competing sector in their model. And so you can think of the Brigden model as simply a highly special, even degenerate case of this more general Stolperstein-Samuelson proposition. So I guess that's in a way where theoretically where the Brigden Report leaves us with this Stolperstein-Samuelson thesis, that yes, a tariff will reduce national income, but yes, within the framework of the model, it will increase the income of a factor which is used relatively intensively in the import competing sector. Okay, well, so let me now turn a little bit more generally to how we would react to this suggestion. How might a friend of humanity oppose protection, okay, even in a Brigden-style world, where, if you like, the average person, right, what they own, namely their labour, that's the factor which is used relatively intensively in the import competing sector. So let's just think about how we might do that. Well, the first thing we could say is the average person might own a significant share of capital too. Obviously, this division of the world into sort of owners of land and owners of labour, or owners of capital and owners of labour, that's a very sort of, it belongs very much to the Victorian sort of world. It's a kind of Marxian assumption, and we're sort of way beyond that now, and we can think that the average person might well own a significant share of capital. But unless shares of capital and labour are strictly equally owned, that observation won't completely deflect Brigden's case for a tariff. There'll still be a sort of, in quotes, optimal tariff. There'll still be the average person will still find it in their interest to have some sort of tariff imposed to increase their wages. Another observation is, well, look, capital owners are people too. Okay? We can't have a system whereby just, say, the median person, policy is to serve the median person and there's almost policy is there to somehow to if you like, to give licence to the plunder of some minority for the benefit of the median person. So one example of this suggestion, look, capital owners of people is the utilitarian philosophy of social warfare, where everybody's utility, right, enters equally into something which we want to maximise. Everybody's utility counts for one. And of course, if under the case of free trade, the marginal utility of capital owners is equal to that of labour, well, free trade will remain optimal under a utilitarian philosophy, even within a Brigden-type world. Okay, so if we start sort of counting everybody equally, then free trade is optimal even under a Brigden-type world. Of course, some people might say, well, look, hang on, the whole point is that under free trade, the marginal utility of capital owners won't be equal to that of labour, it'll be lower because they're so rich, because they own all capital, which is a sort of doubtful assumption. I mean, certainly a lot of capital owners can be poor too, and certainly in the Australian context, there's been plenty of low-income people concentrated in the rural sector. I think the most effective riposte to the kind of Brigden observation was really developed in the later 1930s with the concept with economists getting their head around the concept of potential and actual Pareto improvements, as economists will call them. Just to explain that thought, let's recall, in the Brigden model, the abolition of tariffs will increase national income. In other words, the abolition of tariffs, if I can think of it that way rather than imposition of them, the abolition of tariffs, even within the Brigden world, will increase rents by more than it reduces wages. Okay. Well, given that, the winners from the abolition of tariffs can compensate the losers and still be better off themselves. Okay, this is the key point of a potential Pareto improvement. Free trade, even within the Brigden world, is potentially Pareto, is potentially improving the Pareto sense. The winners can compensate the losers and still be better off themselves. And we can think of it going in the other direction. Suppose we're free trade and somebody says, well, let's raise tariffs to raise wages. Well, you can do that, and in the Brigden world that will raise wages, but it will reduce rents by more than it raises wages. Okay? And so you can think, well, hang on, if you really are interested in wage earners, surely landowners would prefer to would be able to, if you like, say to wage earners, well, look, don't increase tariffs. We'll all be better off by just keeping free trade and just arranging some sort of transfer from landowners to wage earners, landowners to wage earners. Okay? Sort of going in the other direction. Because free trade is cake maximised, right? There always can be side payments and deals, okay, which will dominate any tariff outcome. I think that's the suggestion. That was where I think the economics profession, at least was theoretical, had got by around 1940, as I say, getting say Hicks and Stanleyson, getting their heads around the notion of potential for rate of improvement. Free trade, by maximising the cake, can always dominate any tariff outcomes through its use of side payments. Now, economics didn't stop at 1940, and we have other speakers who will go on to talk about political economy arguments and strategic arguments and so on. But I think I think my brief is to stop before the Second World War, so I'll just stop there, make a few with a sort of concluding sort of comment. I don't think the Brigden Report was a very good thing for Australia, I have to say. In a way, it was the triumph of the Protectionist Party over the Free Trade Party. Okay. As you know, the first election in Australia was between, federal election was between the Protectionist Party and the Free Trade Party, and essentially the Protectionist Party won, and Edward Barton, the leader of the Protection Party, became Prime Minister, and the tariff came in, as Peter Lloyd mentioned. Bruce came along to challenge this thing, but in a way the Brigden Report was using the authority of economists to, if you like, put an imprimatur, right, on the victory of protection, a moderate protectionism, not a fanatical or one-eyed protectionism, but a moderate protectionism. If you like, it was a triumph even of Melbourne, some might say, over Sydney. Melbourne, Victoria, of course, being a location of the Protectionist Party, and New South Wales being the Free Trade Party. So I don't think it was terribly good for economics, for Australia, but I think it was quite good for economics. Okay? I think it sort of stimulated people, economists, to think about, well, what will be the reverberations of free trade, and possibly these reverberations are more significant and more palpable than we had thought, and not merely just the shriek of an insolent monopolist, as Adam Smith would sort of put. Thank you, Andrew.